For this lecture, we're going to be looking at a philosopher and theologian named Anselm of Canterbury. And specifically, what we're going to be looking at is a specific argument that he gives for the existence of God, which has become known as the ontological argument for God's existence. Now, I need to start by saying that this argument is perhaps the most confusing argument for God's existence that shows up in Western philosophy. And I say that just to give you a personal testimony. When I first heard this argument, I was completely lost. I was a freshman in college, so a freshman philosophy introduction 101. We went through several different arguments for God's existence. An argument called the cosmological argument, which starts with the existence of the universe, and then you try to figure out what is the cause of the universe, and you reason that a supreme being called God must be the cause of the universe. And then there's the teleological argument, which focuses on the order and design of nature. And so you ask, well, what is the cause of this design in nature? Well, there must be a higher designer, and that designer is called God. And those arguments, I remember being introduced to those in Philosophy 100. But then we got to the ontological argument, and I didn't even understand what made this an argument. And so if you find yourself in that place as we work through it, if you find yourself in that place after the reading from this past week, that's okay. Most people who are first introduced to this argument find it to be confusing. And so I should say a couple things about it. First, if you want to understand this argument, you really need to know that this is an argument starting with having a proper definition of God. So Anselm argues that if you want to argue for the existence of God, then you have to understand that God is a being for which none greater can be conceived. That's the definition that we have to start with if we're going to be arguing for the existence of God. And so it's a definitional argument, and so we'll take some time to look at it, evaluate it as best as we can in the short amount of time that we have. But you should also know, even though this is a confusing argument and it doesn't immediately seem persuasive, it is an argument that has been very influential throughout the history of philosophy, and we'll look at that just very briefly. But I find it interesting that the philosopher Immanuel Kant actually argued that if this argument is not sound, then the cosmological argument and the teleological argument won't work as well. Now, that's a different discussion, but what's interesting for me is that there are many philosophers who just ignore the ontological argument and focus more on the cosmological and teleological argument, but there are also great giants of philosophy who say that actually the ontological argument, even if they don't buy it, is more important and maybe even more profound. And so hopefully we can get some of the sense of why that is so in this lecture. But to understand the ontological argument, you have to go to Anselm's writings. So you find this argument in his Proslogion, which is a discourse on the existence of God. And Anselm actually starts with his scriptures, the Christian Bible. Now, Anselm has a method that's very similar to Augustine, a method of knowing that starts with faith-seeking understanding. So Anselm argues that we have to start with faith commitments, and then you try to understand your faith commitments after you start with those. And his faith commitments come from the Bible. And he starts specifically with a text found in Psalm 14:1 that says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." Now, Anselm wants to understand why this is so. So he starts with the faith conviction that the fool really does say in his heart that there is no God, and so he starts with the conviction that that's a foolish position, but now he wants to understand what would make that a foolish position, and here's what Anselm writes. Anselm writes, "Even a fool, when he hears of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived," and again, that's how he defines God, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, "even a fool understands what he hears and what he understands in his understanding." So what is he saying here? He's saying, well, you can imagine a being for which nothing greater can be conceived. Which means you have that being in your understanding when you're conceiving of the being of God, that which nothing greater can be conceived. He goes on, and assuredly that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, cannot exist in the understanding alone. For, suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, but that's greater. So if you're just conceiving of this being existing in the understanding alone, well, you can also conceive of this being existing in reality, and if you do that, that's greater than existing in the understanding alone. He continues, therefore, if that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, exists in the understanding alone, the very being, than which nothing greater can be conceived, is one, than which nothing greater can be conceived. But of course, this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. That is the ontological argument. And I think it would be helpful for us to break down what Anselm is doing here. So Anselm is constructing what you might call a reductio ad absurdum argument. And what that means is you assume a position that you're trying to refute for the sake of argument. So the first premise of this argument we could state this way. God exists in the understanding, but God does not exist in reality. So that's a position that Anselm wants to refute. He doesn't agree with this, but you start with that conclusion, and then you try to reduce it to absurdity to show that the conclusion is false, and what follows from that is therefore the opposite of it must be true. So premise 1, God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. 2, existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. That is to say, that it's greater for something to really exist than for it to just be an imaginary thing. 3, God's existence in reality is conceivable. That is, you can conceive of God existing in reality and not just in the understanding. 4, if God did exist in reality, then he would be greater than he is. And that follows from premises 1 and 2. 5, this means that it's conceivable that there is a being greater than God is. And that's from 3 and 4. But here's the absurdity. What you're saying when you say it's conceivable that there's a being greater than God is you're saying it is conceivable that there's a being greater than the being for which nothing greater can be conceived, because that's the definition of God. And so this is a logical absurdity, and what follows from that, according to Anselm, is that it's false that God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. This is the ontological argument. Well, what should we say to this argument? What is the questionable premise? Well, if we want to understand what Anselm is getting at, we have to think of what he means when he says God is that which none greater can be conceived. And there's a big discussion we can have about this definition of God, but I think it's helpful to go back to our distinction between contingent beings versus necessary beings. Or even if we go all the way back to Anaximander, where we did that thought experiment where you can imagine this room not existing, you can imagine the earth not existing, you can imagine the universe not existing, and you can imagine things out of existence. And once you've done that thought experiment, if you ask what is left, well, Anselm might say what's left is that which none greater can be conceived. So the realm of contingent beings consists of things like you and me, this room, the world, the universe, etc. But then once you've imagined contingent beings out of existence, then you come to what we might say is a necessary being. And for Anselm, this being must be self-existence, and the negation of this being cannot even be rationally conceived. That's what it means to talk about a necessary being. And so God is a necessary being, that which nothing greater can be conceived. And go back to the argument with that understanding of God to see if there's any flawed premise. And historically, the one that philosophers have looked at, in fact, the philosopher Immanuel Kant says the most questionable premise is premise 2 of this argument, the fact that existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. And the reason why Kant argued that is because he argued that existence is not a predicate. That is to say that something exists is not to add any information to the thing that you're talking about. So if I say that I have a dog, and my dog is red, well, to say that my dog is red, the phrase is red is adding information about my dog that you should know something about. But if I, after that, say, and my dog exists, or my dog is existent, well, to say that my dog exists does not add any information about the dog because existence, according to Kant, isn't a predicate, and therefore Kant says that this is the biggest problem in Anselm's argument. Another response to Anselm's argument actually I think brings a lot of clarification to what Anselm is saying and what Anselm isn't saying. But the response comes from one of Anselm's contemporary named Ganelio, and his objection to Anselm, speaking on behalf of a fool, says Ganelio, he says, if your argument is correct, then you could prove the existence of anything. So we could imagine the greatest conceivable island. Can you conceive of that greatest conceivable island? Okay, do the thought experiment. Yes, I've got it. It's in my head. Well, now, would that island be greater if it existed in reality and not just in imagination? Well, you might say, yes, it would be greater if it existed in reality. Okay, well then you're saying that there is a greatest conceivable island that exists only in the imagination, but not in reality. Well, that's a contradiction because the greatest conceivable island exists in reality and not just in the imagination alone. Therefore, you've proved the greatest conceivable island. Well, Anselm is not impressed with Ganelio's objection, and he says, Ganelio, you've made a category mistake. An island, by definition, is a contingent thing. Islands aren't things that just exist out of necessity because you can imagine them not existing. And therefore, an island can't be that which nothing greater can be conceived. So we're not talking about just any contingent object because contingent objects do not exist of necessity. And so what we're talking about, says Anselm, is the greatest conceivable being. Once you've done your thought experiment and you've imagined everything out of existence, you get to a point, according to Anselm, where you can't imagine this thing out of existence, and whatever that is the thing that we call God.